January early morning. Western Europe. The ground is hard with frost, the sky still unbroken by light. In a temporary holding area behind American lines, German prisoners of war sit wrapped in thin coats. Their breath fogs the air. They have been awake for hours, not because of noise, but because of its absence. Beyond a low rise of earth, the American camp is alive, yet almost silent. No shouted orders, no clatter of metal. No engines warming carelessly in the dark. Men move as shadows, boots placed carefully, equipment passed hand to hand. Even vehicles are pushed into position before engines are turned over. The prisoners watch closely. Veterans among them recognize what this means. They had known loud armies. They had known frantic preparation, last-minute shouting, officers forcing momentum through chaos. This was different. This was deliberate, measured, controlled. One prisoner later recalled that the silence was worse than artillery. Silence meant planning. Silence meant confidence. Silence meant that somewhere on a timetable already fixed, violence would arrive exactly when intended, and as the horizon begins to pale, that quiet preparation raises a question that can only be answered by looking backward. How did the war arrive at a moment where silence itself became a weapon? By the time German prisoners found themselves watching American units prepare in silence, the war in Western Europe had entered its final, exhausted phase. The Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944 had shattered the illusion of an impenetrable Atlantic wall. What followed was not a single breakthrough, but a grinding campaign of attrition hedgerows, ruined towns, river crossings, each paid for in men and material. By autumn, the German army in the West was no longer the force that had conquered France in 1940. Divisions were under strength. Equipment was scarce. Fuel shortages dictated strategy as much as generals did. American forces, by contrast, had grown heavier, more experienced, and more methodical with every mile advanced. Early improvisation had been replaced by doctrine refined through blood. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support were no longer separate tools, but a single coordinated system. Attacks were planned days in advance, rehearsed in detail, and executed according to strict timetables. Surprise, when achieved, was rarely accidental. The German army's situation worsened dramatically after the failure of its last major counteroffensive in the West, the Ardennes Offensive of December 1944, intended to split Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. The attack instead consumed Germany's remaining mobile reserves. When the snow melted, so did any realistic hope of regaining the initiative. Units that survived the fighting withdrew eastward, leaving behind wounded, stragglers, and thousands of prisoners. Those prisoners often found themselves close enough to the front to observe American preparations firsthand. The U.S. Army, unlike its opponent, could afford to rotate units, resupply continuously, and prepare attacks with precision. Its strength lay not just in firepower, but in predictability of execution. Once an American assault began, it rarely stalled for lack of coordination. German soldiers recognized this pattern quickly. Many had faced American units in earlier engagements where attacks began at first light, following nights of eerie calm. The absence of noise was not neglect, it was discipline. Orders had already been given, every man knew his role. Silence was enforced because surprise was still possible, even in a war that had become brutally familiar. As winter deepened and the front edged closer to Germany itself, this contrast became impossible to ignore. The German army was fighting to delay the inevitable. The Americans were preparing to end it. That difference in mindset, resources, and method shaped the moments the prisoners were now witnessing, and it explains why quiet, of all things, inspired fear. American battlefield silence was not accidental, and it was not improvisation. It was the result of a system designed to remove uncertainty long before the first shot was fired. By late 1944, U.S. Army units in Europe operated according to deeply ingrained procedures. Attack orders were issued well in advance, often supported by detailed maps, aerial reconnaissance, and intelligence summaries drawn from intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations. Movements were scheduled down to the minute. Night was used not for rest, but for positioning, bringing men, weapons, and vehicles forward under cover of darkness. Strict noise discipline was central to this process. Metal was taped or wrapped. Equipment was secured to prevent rattling. Commands were passed in whispers or by hand signals. Engines were kept cold until the last possible moment. In some units, even coughing was suppressed. Silence preserved surprise, but it also reinforced control. Every soldier understood that unnecessary sound endangered not just the mission, but the men beside him. For German prisoners, many of whom had served earlier in the war, this level of order stood in sharp contrast to their own recent experience. By 1945, German formations were often assembled hastily, with replacements who had minimal training and little familiarity with their officers. Orders were rushed, communications were unreliable. Attacks, when attempted, relied on urgency rather than coordination. Noise was not a sign of power, it was a symptom of strain. American quiet signaled the opposite. It suggested an army with time, resources, and confidence. An army that could afford patience because it already controlled the outcome. POWs understood that this calm was temporary. They had seen what followed. Dawn attacks were favored not for drama, but for efficiency, limited visibility for defenders, predictable light conditions, and maximum coordination with artillery and air support. Reports from captured German soldiers repeatedly noted this pattern. Nights of stillness were followed by overwhelming force applied with precision. Barrages arrived on schedule. Infantry advanced behind them without hesitation. Armor appeared where expected, not because the enemy guessed, but because the plan demanded it. The prisoners watching the silent American camp were not imagining what would come. They were remembering it, and as the first light began to gather at the edge of the sky, the war they had known, loud, chaotic, desperate, was about to collide once more with a very different way of fighting. That collision is best understood by examining the moment from multiple angles, each revealing a different source of the same fear. For German prisoners, fear did not come from direct threat. They were already disarmed, already captured. Yet what they observed unsettled them more than the fighting that had led them there. They watched American soldiers prepare without visible tension. Faces were calm, movements were economical. No one appeared rushed. For men who had spent years in a war increasingly defined by panic and improvisation, this composure was deeply disturbing. It suggested that the coming violence had already been mentally resolved. That the outcome was assumed? Several German POW accounts describe this quiet as unnatural. War, as they had experienced it, was loud before it was deadly. Here the reverse was true. Silence became the warning. American doctrine favored first light for a reason. Dawn offered just enough visibility to coordinate movement while still obscuring targets at distance. Defenders were often fatigued from night alert. Communication lagged in the low light. Attacks launched at this hour maximized confusion while minimizing risk to advancing troops. The silence beforehand ensured that this advantage was preserved until the last possible second. German soldiers late in the war understood desperation. They had lived it. American silence communicated its opposite: control, not just over the battlefield but over time itself. The attack would not come early out of anxiety. It would not be delayed by hesitation. It would come exactly when planned. That certainty, more than noise or numbers, is what terrified those watching. These angles reveal different faces of the same moment, but they do not yet explain how such discipline was sustained across an entire army. To understand that, the focus must shift to the systems and leadership that made this silence possible. American officers in the European theater were trained to value preparation over improvisation. By late 1944, command culture emphasized adherence to plan unless conditions clearly demanded change. This reduced uncertainty for the men carrying out orders. When the time came to move, there was no debate, no confusion. Silence was easier to maintain because hesitation had already been removed. German POWs often noted that American units did not rely on dramatic gestures or shouted commands. Authority was embedded in structure. Orders had been given hours earlier. What remained was execution. Behind the silence stood overwhelming logistical support. Radios worked. Ammunition arrived on schedule. Artillery units were already registered on their targets. Engineers had prepared routes forward. Silence was possible because nothing was being improvised at the last moment. German forces, lacking fuel, spare parts, and reliable communications could not replicate this approach even if they had wanted to. Noise became a byproduct of scarcity. For the prisoners, this quiet also carried a moral weight. It suggested an army that no longer romanticized combat. There was no visible enthusiasm, no hatred on display. The Americans prepared not with fury, but with inevitability. This stripped the coming battle of any sense of honor or drama. It would be efficient. It would be final, taken together. These angles converge on a single truth. Silence was not the absence of action, but the final stage before it. As the night thinned and shapes became clearer in the half-light, preparation gave way to execution. The moment the prisoners had been anticipating yet dreading was about to arrive. The final hour before dawn is the longest. For the German prisoners, this is the moment when silence becomes unbearable. They know enough to recognize the signs. The preparation is finished. Nothing more will change. Whatever plan exists is now fixed in time. Across the line, artillery crews wait beside their guns. Fire missions have been calculated hours earlier. Coordinates are already written. The first shells will not search for targets. They will arrive exactly where intended. Infantry units closest to the front have been in position since the night before. Engineers have cleared paths. Armor waits behind cover, engines cold, crews seated inside. This stillness does not feel cautious. It feels rehearsed. In previous battles, German soldiers had learned to listen for warning engines revving too early. Shouted orders, the clatter of equipment betraying movement. Here there is nothing. The absence of sound denies them even the comfort of anticipation. They cannot count down to the attack because there is no audible marker to begin the count. A few minutes before the scheduled time, final checks are made. Helmets are adjusted. Weapons are gripped more tightly. Somewhere, an officer glances once more at his watch. No signal is given, none is needed. The prisoners sense the shift before they can see it. The quiet has changed. It has narrowed, focused, like the held breath before impact. When the first sound finally comes, it does not rise gradually. It arrives all at once. But before that moment breaks the silence completely, the last seconds stretch thin balanced between night and morning, between preparation and destruction. At the precise moment planned hours earlier, the silence ends. Artillery speaks first. Not in scattered bursts, but in a single, coordinated eruption that rolls across the landscape. Shells strike along preselected lines, tearing into known defensive positions, crossroads, and communication points. The timing is exact. There is no adjustment fire. The guns had already found their targets before the night began. For the German prisoners, the effect is immediate and overwhelming. The sudden transition from near total quiet to controlled devastation confirms what they had feared. This is not an attack born of opportunity. It is the execution of a decision already made. Infantry moves as the barrage lifts. American soldiers rise and advance in practiced intervals, using the smoke and dust exactly as intended. There is no shouting. Commands are relayed by gesture and movement. The noise now belongs entirely to weapons, not to confusion. Armored vehicles follow on schedule. Engines start only when required, their sound emerging from behind terrain already secured by fire. Tanks do not rush forward blindly. They move along routes prepared in advance, supporting infantry rather than leading recklessly. On the German side of the line, resistance is fragmented. Defensive positions, already strained by shortages and fatigue, are struck simultaneously. Communication breaks down almost immediately. Orders cannot keep pace with events. Units react rather than respond. Those prisoners watching from behind American lines understand what this means. They have lived through similar moments from the other side. Once an American attack reaches this phase, stopping it becomes nearly impossible. Momentum is not emotional, it is structural. Within hours, the objectives identified on American maps are taken. Strong points are bypassed or reduced methodically. Surviving German troops withdraw or surrender in groups, often stunned by the speed with which their positions have been neutralized. By mid-morning, the battlefield has changed shape. What had been a line is now a series of isolated pockets. The silence of the night has been replaced by the controlled noise of consolidation engines idling, medics working, prisoners being gathered. For the Germans who had watched the dawn arrive in silence, the lesson is unmistakable. The quiet had not been restraint. It had been certainty. And certainty, once unleashed, leaves consequences that extend far beyond the moment of impact. The battlefield in the hours after the attack bears little resemblance to the stillness that preceded it. American units move forward deliberately, securing ground already marked on their maps. Engineers clear remaining obstacles. Medics work along routes planned in advance. Prisoners are processed efficiently, searched, counted, and moved away from the fighting. There is no celebration. The operation is treated as a task completed, not a victory earned through spectacle. German losses, while varying by sector, follow a familiar late-war pattern. Defensive positions collapse faster than replacements can be committed. Units retreat without cohesion, often leaving equipment behind due to fuel shortages or damaged transport. Captured soldiers report confusion rather than shock. Many say they never understood where the attack was coming from until it was already over. American after-action reports emphasize timing and coordination. Objectives are taken within expected windows. Artillery expenditures align with projections. Casualties, though present, are lower than in earlier phases of the campaign. The system has worked as designed. For German prisoners, the aftermath reinforces what they had sensed before dawn. This was not an exceptional assault, it was routine. The quiet preparation, the synchronized strike, the rapid consolidation all point to a method refined through repetition. The Americans are no longer adapting to the war. The war is adapting to them. Psychologically, this realization weighs heavily. Many prisoners speak later of a sense of finality. Not just about the battle they have lost, but about the war itself. The silence they observed is understood in hindsight as a sign that resistance no longer shapes outcomes. It only delays them. As American forces continue their advance, the consequences of such operations extend outward, reshaping the front line and narrowing the space in which Germany can continue to fight. Those broader effects become clearer when the immediate battlefield fades into the larger strategic picture. Beyond the captured ground and the counted prisoners, the impact of such operations compounds rapidly. Each successful, precisely executed American attack reduces Germany's ability to stabilize the front. Terrain lost at dawn cannot be easily regained by afternoon. Units pulled back to plug gaps arrive already weakened, often without heavy weapons or adequate transport. The pattern repeats itself: quiet nights, decisive mornings. Shrinking options. German command reports from this period increasingly reflect resignation rather than strategy. References to delaying actions replace plans for counteroffensives. The goal becomes time, not victory. For soldiers at the front, this shift is unmistakable. Morale erodes not because of a single defeat, but because defeats now arrive predictably. American silence plays an unexpected role in this psychological collapse. It signals that the enemy is not reacting emotionally. There is no sense of urgency, no visible strain. The war appears to be managed, scheduled, and concluded in stages. For those fighting on the losing side, this is devastating. Prisoners taken after such attacks frequently express relief rather than shame. Captivity becomes preferable to facing another dawn preceded by that same quiet. Interrogation summaries note a recurring theme. German soldiers expected the Americans to win not because of brutality, but because of organization. The outcome feels decided by systems larger than any individual act of courage. Strategically, these operations accelerate the Allied advance into the German heartland. River crossings are prepared the same way. Urban assaults follow similar patterns. Silence, coordination, and overwhelming support define each phase. By the time the Rhine is crossed and central Germany is reached, resistance is fragmented beyond recovery. The war's end does not arrive suddenly. It approaches steadily, announced not by chaos but by routine. And it is this quiet inevitability observed by prisoners before a single shot was fired that gives the moment its lasting meaning. That meaning becomes clear only when the noise fades and reflection begins. War is often imagined as a cacophony: guns, shouts, explosions, but history shows that some of the most decisive moments are defined by the opposite: discipline, timing, and silence. The German prisoners who watched the Americans prepare at dawn were witnessing a different kind of power. One measured not in fury but in precision. The quiet before the attack was more than strategy. It was a signal of control. It conveyed the weight of planning, the reach of logistics, and the confidence of an army that knew its own capabilities. For the prisoners, fear was born not from what they saw happen, but from what they knew would happen, a reminder that wars are often decided before the first shot rings out. This moment also illustrates a broader truth about modern warfare. Technology, coordination, and methodical preparation can amplify force far beyond the sum of soldiers and weapons. Battles are shaped as much by mental and organizational discipline as by courage or numbers. In this light, the dawn attack becomes more than a tactical maneuver. It is a lesson in how wars are structured, fought, and ultimately won. As the fog lifts over the fields and the echoes fade, one fact remains. The fear inspired by silent preparation is a testament to the quiet efficiency of a force that operates with inevitability. The German post understood in those few tense hours that war can be measured not in noise, but in the precise unfolding of plans, in the calm that precedes the storm, and in the inevitability of an army that strikes when the moment is chosen, not forced. The silence, once broken, left nothing uncertain, only the consequences.